The neon lights of Zalara Minor flickered weakly, their glow struggling against the heavy rain that poured down from the smog-ridden sky. The city was a labyrinth of towering buildings and forgotten alleys, where those discarded by society scraped together whatever existence they could manage. Among them walked Dr. Benji Rowan, his long coat soaked from the relentless downpour, his medical bag slung over his shoulder as he made his way back to his mobile clinic after a long day treating the sick and the wounded. His work was never done in a place like this. The underbelly of Zalara Minor was filled with people who had nowhere else to go, criminals, refugees, and those who simply didn't fit into the rigid hierarchies of the more civilized planets. And yet, despite its grime and its dangers, Benji had grown to love this place. It was where his skills mattered most. As he turned a corner into a dimly lit alley, a muffled sound caught his attention. It was a voice, weak, almost lost to the noise of the rain. His gaze flickered to a pile of discarded crates and tattered tarps, where a hunched figure sat curled up against the cold metal wall. A child clung tightly to the woman's side, barely visible under the soaked fabric of what had once been a cloak. Benji hesitated only for a second before stepping forward. He had seen enough suffering in his life to recognize the desperate kind. "Hey," he called out gently, kneeling beside them. "Are you hurt?" The woman flinched at his voice, her head snapping up. In the dim light, he saw her face, a mixture of alien features, with dark, mottled skin and eyes that shimmered faintly with a bioluminescent glow. She had a distinct asymmetry to her features, a sharp contrast to the smooth, almost sculpted symmetry he had seen in others of her kind before. She was Lemurian. Benji had treated a few Lemurians in the past, though only those considered acceptable by their society's stringent beauty standards. The race was known across the stars for their ethereal, almost artistic perfection. This woman, however, had none of that. Her features were uneven, her skin rougher than that of the porcelain-smooth nobles he had seen before. She was not what her people would consider beautiful. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. She had been abandoned. The child beside her clung to her with quiet desperation, her tiny frame trembling from the cold. She was small, too small for her age, Benji guessed, judging by her frail limbs and the hollowness of her cheeks. The woman looked at him warily, her posture tense. She expected cruelty, rejection, the kind she had no doubt endured her whole life. Benji offered her a reassuring smile. "You're freezing. Come with me. I have a clinic nearby. It's warm, and I can take a look at you both, make sure you're okay." For a long moment, she didn't respond. Then, with a shuddering breath, she nodded. Carefully, Benji helped her to her feet. The child whimpered as she was lifted, but the woman soothed her quickly, whispering something in a language Benji didn't understand. They were both exhausted, their bodies stiff from exposure. As he guided them back through the winding streets toward his clinic, Benji's mind raced with questions. Who was she? How had she ended up here, alone and abandoned with a child? He had a feeling he was about to find out. The warmth of the clinic was a stark contrast to the cold streets outside. The small space was cluttered, but well-equipped, a haven for those who had nowhere else to turn. Benji led the woman and child inside, shutting the door behind them as he gestured toward the examination table. "Sit," he said gently. "Let me take a look at you." The woman hesitated before finally obeying, settling onto the table while still cradling the child protectively in her arms. Up close, Benji could see just how exhausted she was. Her hands trembled slightly, and her breathing was uneven. He crouched beside them, pulling out his scanner to assess their vitals. The readings flashed across the screen in alien script, confirming what he already suspected. Malnutrition, dehydration, months, if not years of suffering. "You're severely undernourished," he told her, keeping his voice soft. "You both are. When was the last time you had a proper meal?" She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost ashamed. "I don't remember." Benji exhaled slowly. "You're safe here. No one's going to hurt you. What's your name?" A long silence stretched between them before she finally whispered, "Mira?" He turned his attention to the child. She had been staring at him with wide, fat, unblinking eyes since they arrived, her grip on her mother never loosening. "And your little one?" Mira's hold tightened protectively. "Lila?" Benji offered the girl a small smile. "Hey there, Lila." The child didn't respond, simply pressed her face against her mother's chest as if trying to disappear. Benji sighed and reached into a nearby storage compartment, pulling out a ration pack. "She needs food first," he said, handing it to Mira. "You both do." Mira hesitated before accepting the package. As soon as she opened it, Lila reached for the food eagerly, stuffing small bites into her mouth with a hunger that made Benji's chest ache. As Mira fed her daughter, Benji ran more diagnostics. He worked quietly, letting them eat in peace while he assessed their conditions. As he studied the results, he noticed something unusual in Mira's genetic readings. Something that didn't make sense. Her blood markers were royal. Benji's brow furrowed. The Lumerians were a notoriously selective race, their aristocracy ruling with near absolute authority. If Mira had royal blood, then why had she been abandoned? He glanced at her again, watching as she carefully brushed Lila's hair, soothing the child's nerves. There was something regal in her movements, in the quiet strength she carried despite her hardships. "Mira," he said carefully, setting down the scanner. "Where exactly are you from?" She froze. Her reaction was answer enough. Benji straightened, realization settling over him like a heavy weight. She wasn't just a lost outcast, she was a banished princess, and he had just pulled her and her child from the brink of death. Benji knew then that whatever he had just stumbled into was far bigger than he had imagined. He had given them shelter, safety, but how long before the people who cast her out came looking? And more importantly, what would they do when they found her? The realization settled over Benji like a storm cloud, dark and pressing. Mira wasn't just another outcast struggling to survive in the underbelly of Zalara Minor. She was someone important, someone whose very existence had been deemed unworthy by her own people. And now, here she was, sitting in his clinic, her frail daughter curled up in her lap, eating as if she had never known the comfort of a full stomach. Benji hesitated before speaking, choosing his words carefully. "Mira, your blood work came back with some unusual markers." He kept his tone neutral, not wanting to startle her. "You have royal genetic signatures." Mira tensed immediately, her grip on Lila tightening. For a long moment, she said nothing. The hum of the clinic's machinery filled the silence, punctuated only by the occasional beep from the diagnostic scanner still running in the background. Finally, she exhaled a slow, shuddering breath. "I was never meant to be part of that world," she whispered. "They cast me out before I was even old enough to understand why." Benji pulled up a stool and sat across from her, watching her closely. "Why?" he asked softly. Mira's expression was unreadable. "Because I wasn't perfect." She lifted her chin slightly, as if daring him to contradict her. The glow of her skin, usually faint, darkened slightly with her shifting emotions. Benji had heard stories of the Lumerians' obsession with beauty, of how their ruling class engineered perfection into every generation, ensuring their royal lines remained pristine. The idea that someone could be exiled for simply not meeting their standard of beauty made his stomach turn. "My mother tried to hide me for as long as she could," Mira continued, her voice quieter now. "But my father, he saw me as an embarrassment, a mutation. He had me sent away as soon as I was old enough to understand that I didn't belong." Benji frowned, his hands tightening into fists. "So they just threw you away?" He couldn't keep the anger out of his voice. Mira's laugh was hollow. "I wasn't the first. I won't be the last." Benji rubbed his jaw, trying to process everything. "And Lila?" Mira's gaze softened as she looked down at her daughter, who had finally dozed off, her tiny body rising and falling with each steady breath. "She's like me," Mira admitted. "Not perfect." Benji let out a slow breath, leaning forward. "And her father?" Mira's lips pressed into a thin line. "Dead," she said simply. He didn't push for details. Grief in her voice was enough to tell him that the wounds were still fresh. Benji sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. He had spent years helping people no one else would. Criminals, outcasts, the forgotten souls of the galaxy. But this was monstrous. "I don't care what your people say," he finally said, meeting her gaze. "There's nothing wrong with you. Or with Lila." Mira's eyes widened slightly, as if no one had ever said those words to her before. And maybe, Benji realized, no one ever had. She blinked, quickly looking away. "It doesn't matter," she said. "My father's people are everywhere. The moment they realize I'm alive, they'll come for me." Benji studied her carefully. Then we make sure they don't find you." Mira's breath caught, and when she looked at him again, there was something vulnerable in her expression, something fragile, as if the smallest push might break her. "You'd do that?" she asked, as if the very idea was impossible. Benji gave a small, tired smile. "Of course." And just like that, her entire world shifted. The following days passed in a quiet sort of urgency. Mira and Lila remained hidden within Benji's clinic, resting and regaining their strength while he worked tirelessly to secure a more permanent solution. He reached out to a few contacts, people who specialized in making people disappear, people who could be trusted. But something gnawed at the back of his mind. Mira's father was a king, a powerful one, and if her exile had been a secret, that meant someone had gone to great lengths to erase her existence. If they learned she was alive, there was no telling how far they would go to correct that mistake. That fear was confirmed one evening when Benji noticed a strange figure loitering outside his clinic. The man was tall, dressed in dark, well-fitted armor that bore no insignia, no sign of allegiance. But Benji knew exactly what he was looking at. A royal enforcer. His blood ran cold. Benji turned away from the window, his mind racing. He had seen bounty hunters before. Mercenaries looking to make a quick credit by capturing fugitives. But this wasn't a bounty hunter. This was a specialist. Someone sent by the Lumerian royal court. Someone who already knew where to look. Benji's heart pounded as he hurried back into the clinic's interior. Mira was in one of the back rooms, sitting beside Layla, who was playing quietly with a small set of toys Benji had managed to find. "Mira," Benji said, voice low but urgent, "we have a problem." She looked up immediately, her entire body tensing at the look on his face. "What is it?" "There's someone outside," he said. "Someone looking for you." Mira's expression shattered into pure fear. Benji quickly knelt beside her, his hands firm on her shoulders. "We need to move. Now." Mira swallowed hard, glancing at Lila, then back at him. "Where?" Benji had already thought of that. "There's an old cargo port near the outskirts of the city. I have a friend there, Jenna. She can get you off-world." Mira hesitated, looking at Lila. "And you?" Benji hesitated. He should have expected that question, but the truth was he hadn't thought beyond keeping them safe, beyond her. "I'll get you out of the city first," he said. "We'll figure it out from there." Mira searched his face as if trying to memorize every detail. Then, finally, she nodded. Benji exhaled. "All right, grab what you can carry. We leave in 10 minutes. Mira stood, scooping Lila into her arms, pressing a soft kiss to her daughter's forehead. Benji turned, heart pounding, moving quickly to shut down the clinic's primary systems. If the enforcer had already found them, they didn't have much time. As he peered outside again, he caught a glimpse of the man still standing there, unmoving, his gaze fixed on the clinic's entrance. They had to move fast, because this was only the beginning. The rain had stopped by the time Benji led Mira and Lila out the back door of his clinic, but the air was still thick with tension. The city around them was alive with the usual chaos. Flashing neon lights reflected off wet pavement, the hum of air traffic above mixing with the distant chatter of vendors, and the occasional burst of static from patrol drones scanning the streets. But tonight, it all felt sharper, like a knife pressed too close to the skin. Mira clutched Lila close to her chest, her eyes darting between the dark alleyways and the figures moving in the distance. The little girl was silent, as if she understood the weight of their fear, her bioluminescent eyes barely visible beneath the hood of the oversized cloak Benji had given her. Benji's pulse thrummed in his ears as he led them down a side path between rusted cargo containers. They had to move fast. The enforcer wasn't just waiting anymore, he was tracking them. Every instinct in Benji's body told him they were being watched, followed. If they stayed in one place too long, they would be trapped. "We'll take the underpass," he whispered to Mira, gesturing toward a grated tunnel entrance beneath the industrial sector. "It leads to the old freight district. Jenna's ship is docked there." Mira didn't argue. She just nodded and tightened her hold on Lila, stepping carefully as they descended into the tunnel. The air was damp, filled with the scent of rust and stagnant water. Benji could hear the distant echo of their footsteps bouncing off the curved metal walls. It made him uneasy. If he could hear them, so could the enforcer. Halfway through the tunnel, Mira suddenly tensed, her grip on his arm tightening. Something's wrong, she whispered. Benji stopped, listening. At first, there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the city above. Then, a sound, faint, rhythmic, metallic. Footsteps. Someone was following them. A flicker of movement appeared at the far entrance of the tunnel, barely visible in the dim glow of the emergency lights. A shadow detached from the darkness, tall and methodical in its approach. The enforcer had found them. Mira inhaled sharply, her whole body coiling with tension. Benji grabbed her wrist. Run. She didn't hesitate. They bolted down the tunnel, their footsteps hammering against the metal floor. Behind them, the enforcer moved with terrifying precision. No wasted energy. No hesitation. He wasn't chasing them. He was hunting. Benji turned sharply at an intersecting passage and pulled Mira into a service corridor. They pressed themselves against the wall, Mira shielding Lila against her chest, both of them barely daring to breathe. The footsteps slowed. Benji's mind raced. They needed a distraction. A flickering maintenance panel caught his eye. Quickly, he reached into his coat, pulled out a small medical cauterizer, and jammed it against the exposed wiring. Sparks erupted in a sudden burst, triggering an alarm. The tunnel filled with flashing red lights and a blaring siren. A fire warning. It was enough. The enforcer stopped, assessing the situation. The pause lasted only a few seconds, but it was all they needed. Benji grabbed Mira's hand. Move. They sprinted toward the emergency exit at the far end of the tunnel, bursting into the open air of the freight district just as the sirens echoed behind them. Ahead, the docks stretched into the distance, a maze of abandoned cargo units and half-functional landing pads. At the far end, beneath a flickering docking light, Jenna's ship waited. They were almost there. Then, the roar of an engine overhead made Benji's stomach drop. A second enforcer ship was circling above, scanning the area. Jenna must have spotted them because her voice crackled through Benji's earpiece. I see you. Get your asses on board now. Mira gritted her teeth, pushing forward despite her exhaustion. But the ship above had already marked them. They were out of time. Benji grabbed the emergency beacon from his belt, activated it, and tossed it behind them. The device detonated with a flashbang of light and sound, disrupting the enforcer's sensors, just long enough for them to make a run for the ship. Jenna opened the rear hatch, and Benji practically threw Mira and Lila inside before diving in after them. The ship's engines roared to life. As the ramp sealed shut behind them, Benji slumped against the wall, his chest heaving. They had made it. For now. Jenna's ship rocketed through the planet's atmosphere, dodging scanning beams from the pursuing enforcer ship. The entire cabin rumbled as she pushed the engines to their limit, weaving through the debris fields that surrounded Zalara Minor's orbital lanes. Benji pulled himself up, watching as Mira clutched Lila in the co-pilot's chair, whispering soothing words to her. Lila had her hands over her ears, her small body trembling from the chaos of their escape. Jenna's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. They're locking weapons on us. We've got less than a minute before they open fire. Benji grabbed the nearest console, bracing himself. Tell me you've got a plan. Jenna let out a dry laugh, flipping several switches. I've got several, none of them good. The ship lurched violently as a plasma bolt narrowly missed them. The enforcer ship was closing the distance. Benji could already see the telltale glow of another charging shot. Then, an unexpected transmission came through. A royal command code. The enforcer ship hesitated. Mira's face paled. Benji turned to her. What just happened? Mira's hands trembled as she reached for the communicator. The message repeated, 3 sharp tones, followed by a phrase in Lemurian. Mira swallowed hard. It's from my father. Benji's stomach tightened. He knows. Jenna cursed under her breath. Well, that complicates things. The enforcer ship ceased its attack. Instead, it began relaying the transmission directly to Jenna's console. The message was clear. King Malrek demanded to speak to his daughter. Immediately, Mira took a deep breath, then turned to Benji. If I don't answer, they'll send an entire fleet after us. Benji's jaw clenched. He had seen what rulers like Malrek did to those they deemed worthless. Then we're not letting you go alone, he said. Mira met his gaze, something deep and unreadable flickering in her bioluminescent eyes. You don't have to do this, Benji. He took her hand. You're right, I don't, but I want to. For the first time since he met her, Mira didn't argue. She turned back to Jenna and gave a single nod. Jenna sighed. All right, but if we die, I'm haunting you both. With a deep breath, Mira answered the call. The holographic projector flickered to life, and the imposing figure of King Malrek appeared before them. His gaze swept over the cabin. When he saw Mira, his expression was unreadable. Then his cold voice rang through the ship. Daughter. Mira's fingers dug into the chair's armrest, but her voice remained steady. Father. Benji didn't know what was about to happen, but he was damn sure he wasn't letting her face it alone. The flickering blue light of the hologram filled the cockpit, casting eerie shadows across the cabin walls. King Malrek's regal form was as imposing as Mira remembered, tall, wrapped in layers of traditional Lemurian armor, with the distinct shimmering skin of their kind. His presence, even from light years away, carried the weight of absolute authority. His glowing eyes locked onto hers, cold and unreadable, and for a moment, no one spoke. Mira's grip tightened on the chair's armrest. She had spent years preparing for this moment, rehearsing all the words she would say if she ever faced him again. But now, confronted by the man who had cast her out like an inconvenient burden, her voice almost failed her. Almost. You have finally decided to crawl from the shadows, King Malrek said, his tone smooth but laced with condescension. I was beginning to think you had died in some nameless gutter. Mira's jaw clenched, but she refused to lower her gaze. I'm alive, no thanks to you. Benji, standing beside her, could feel the tension crackling between them. He had seen powerful leaders before, men and women who commanded armies with a single glance. But Malrek was different. There was something ruthless about him, something that made it clear he did not tolerate failure, nor sentiment. The king tilted his head slightly. And the child? My granddaughter? His gaze shifted toward Lila, who was huddled in the co-pilot's seat, her small hands gripping Mira's cloak. Mira instinctively pulled Lila closer. She is none of your concern. She is of my blood, Malrek countered. That makes her my concern. A silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Benji could feel Mira trembling slightly, though whether it was from fear or fury, he wasn't sure. The king sighed, as if this conversation were an inconvenience. I have sent enforcers to retrieve you. You will return to Lemuria immediately. Mira's breath caught. I will not return, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but unyielding. Malrek regarded her for a long moment, then let out a quiet chuckle. Still defiant, even after all these years, you have not changed. Mira's heart pounded. She knew this game, knew the way he manipulated people with carefully chosen words and thinly veiled threats. And yet, she also knew that he did nothing without purpose. You don't want me back, she said, searching his expression. If you did, you would have sent for me years ago. You're only demanding my return now because I have something you want. The briefest flicker of something crossed Malrek's face before it vanished. Mira knew she was right. It is not you that I need, Malrek admitted, his voice turning colder. It is the child. A chill ran down Mira's spine. Benji stepped forward. You're not taking her. Malrek barely acknowledged him. A human speaking for my daughter. How quaint, he said, his tone dripping with disdain. But this is not your concern, Doctor. Like hell it isn't, Benji shot back. You abandoned them. They survived without you, and now you think you can just claim them when it's convenient for you? The king's eyes narrowed slightly, the first sign of true irritation. You do not understand the politics at play. The child carries my lineage, my bloodline. The royal court is divided, and there are those who would see my rule weakened. A granddaughter, an heir, is a powerful symbol. Her existence can be used to secure the throne against my enemies. Mira inhaled sharply. So you want to use her? I want to protect her, Malrek corrected. Something you clearly cannot do while hiding in the filth of the Outer Rim. Mira shook her head, her voice shaking with anger. She is not a pawn. She is my daughter, and I will never let you take her. Malrek's expression darkened. Then you leave me no choice. The transmission cut out. A sudden alarm blared through the ship. Jenna cursed from the pilot's chair. We've got incoming. 2 Lemurian warships just dropped out of hyperspace. Benji grabbed the back of Mira's seat, his heart hammering. How fast can we get out of here? Jenna's fingers flew over the controls. Not fast enough. Mira turned to him, her face pale but determined. We have to fight. Benji's gut twisted, but he nodded. Then let's make sure they regret coming after us. The ship shuddered violently as the first blast from the warships struck their shields. Jenna swore under her breath, yanking the controls as she sent the ship into a sharp dive, narrowly avoiding the second attack. "Shields are at 60%, she yelled. "I can't outrun them in a straight fight." Benji turned to Mira. "Any chance we can convince your father to back off?" Mira's expression was grim. "If we surrender, he'll take Lila. And you? He'll kill you." "Great. Love those odds." Jenna threw the ship into a sudden barrel roll, dodging another plasma shot. The gravity shift sent Benji sprawling, catching himself against the console. Mira held Lila tightly, shielding her as best as she could. Through the viewport, Benji saw two sleek Lumerian ships closing in, their cannons glowing with charged plasma. "Tell me you have weapons," he shouted to Jenna. "Do I look like an idiot?" She snapped back, flipping switches. "But we're outgunned. If we don't do something smart, we're toast." Mira's eyes darted toward the navigation console. "There's an asteroid field nearby," she said quickly. "Dense, unpredictable. If we can lure them in." Jenna grinned. "I like the way you think." She throttled the engines, sending the ship rocketing toward the massive debris field ahead. The Lumerian warships followed, firing relentlessly, but Jenna was too fast, too unpredictable. Mira kept her eyes on the enemy ships, watching the way they maneuvered, their patterns. "Their pilots are trained for formation flying, not close-quarters asteroid navigation," she muttered. "They'll have to slow down to avoid a crash." Benji glanced at her. "How do you know that?" Mira hesitated. "I used to train with them." Benji stared. "You were a pilot?" She shrugged, her expression unreadable. "My father didn't want me on the throne, so he had me trained for war instead, until he realized I wasn't fit for that either." Benji wanted to ask more, but there was no time. Jenna dropped the ship into a tight spiral, weaving through the jagged asteroid field. As predicted, the Lumerian warships hesitated, forced to slow down. That hesitation was all they needed. Mira slammed the targeting console, locking onto a cluster of unstable asteroids. "Fire now." Jenna didn't ask twice. She unleashed a missile barrage, striking the asteroid's dead center. The resulting explosion sent a shockwave through the field, hurling massive rock fragments into the enemy ships. One warship was instantly crushed, its hull buckling under the impact. The second ship tried to pull back, but Jenna was already on the attack. She spun the ship around and let loose with everything they had. The second warship detonated in a fireball, debris scattering into the void. For a moment, silence. Then Jenna let out a breathless laugh. "Well, that was fun." Mira pulled Lila into her arms, holding her tightly. Benji slumped back in his seat, exhaling. They had won. But they all knew one thing. King Malrek would not give up. This was just the beginning. Silence settled over the ship's cabin, but it was not the comforting kind. It was the kind that came with the weight of knowing they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The wreckage of the Lumerian warships still drifted behind them, burning remnants of a battle that had changed everything. Jenna was still at the helm, her fingers hovering over the controls, her breathing uneven. "I can't believe we just did that," she muttered. "We just shot down 2 royal warships." Benji leaned against the bulkhead, exhausted but alert. "We didn't have a choice." Mira sat with Lila curled up in her lap, holding her daughter tightly, as if she could shield her from what had just happened. Her skin still glowed faintly with the residual energy of adrenaline and fear. "No," she murmured, voice hollow. "We didn't." Benji studied her carefully. She had spent her whole life running from the weight of her father's power, but now for the first time she had fought back, and there would be consequences. Jenna checked the scanners. "No more pursuers, for now." She exhaled sharply. "But we can't stay out in open space. If Malrek doesn't already have a fleet hunting us, he will soon." Mira was staring at nothing, lost in thought. "He won't stop," she finally said. "Not now. Not ever." Benji ran a hand down his face. He had known, from the moment he decided to help Mira and Lila, that there was no easy way out. But he had hoped that maybe they could disappear, find a place where Malrek's reach wouldn't touch them. That hope was gone now. Mira turned her gaze to Benji. "I can't keep running anymore." The word settled heavily in the air. Benji straightened. "So what do we do?" Mira's bioluminescent eyes darkened. "We take this fight to him." Jenna let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. I think you hit your head too hard during that fight. You want to go up against a king? Mira didn't blink. We don't have a choice. He won't stop hunting us until I'm back under his control and Lila is on his throne. Benji stepped closer. So we don't let that happen. Jenna groaned, rubbing her temples. I can't believe I'm about to say this, but do you have a plan? Or are we just going to knock on the palace door and ask him nicely to leave you alone? Mira looked at Jenna, then Benji. Her expression was resolute. We send a message to the Lumerian court. Benji frowned. What kind of message? Mira's hands clenched. I'm not just some runaway princess anymore. I'm the rightful heir, banished or not. My blood is royal. And there are factions within the court that oppose my father's rule. If we can reach them, if we can make them see what kind of ruler Malrek really is, we might have a chance. Jenna crossed her arms. You're suggesting a coup. Mira met her gaze without hesitation. I'm suggesting justice. Benji felt a strange sense of pride stir in his chest. Mira had spent years living in the shadows, believing she was worthless because of the way she looked. But here she was now, standing taller than ever, ready to take back her life. We make the call, he said firmly, and we see who's willing to listen. Mira nodded. Then let's end this. The message was sent. Using encrypted channels, Mira broadcast a statement to the reformists within the Lumerian court, revealing that she was alive and that King Malrek had been hunting her, not because she was a threat, but because he feared what she represented. A daughter he had discarded was now standing against him, with an heir he wanted to control. The response came faster than any of them had expected. Mira's message had sparked a rebellion. By the time they reached Lumeria's outer orbit, the planet was already in turmoil. Malrek's political opponents had rallied, declaring that his actions against his own bloodline had disgraced the throne. His enemies had waited for an opportunity, and Mira had given it to them. Jenna's ship touched down just outside the royal citadel. The city was alive with protesters, their voices rising against the monarchy. Royal guards had formed defensive lines around the palace, but they were outnumbered. The people were angry, not just because of Mira, but because Malrek had ruled with fear for too long. Inside the palace, King Malrek stood before the court, seething. His once loyal nobles now questioned his judgment, his authority. And then she arrived. Mira stepped into the grand hall, flanked by Benji and a delegation of reformists. She no longer looked like an exile. She looked like a queen. Malrek's golden eyes locked onto her with pure fury. You have no place here, he spat. Mira held Lila close, her voice steady. I have every right to be here, and you know it. Gasps rippled through the court. Malrek scoffed, but he knew he was cornered. He could no longer control the narrative, not with the entire city watching, not with half the court already siding with his opponents. You think you can take my throne? Malrek sneered. Mira's eyes blazed. I think you already lost it. The reformists stepped forward, their voices loud and clear. The people have spoken, Malrek. Your reign is over. Malrek's face contorted with rage, but even he knew when a battle was lost. The guards turned their weapons on him, and just like that, the king fell. Mira's breath shook as she watched her father's once mighty presence crumble. For so long she had feared him, had believed the lie that she was less because of him. But now, she was free. The reformists formally declared Mira as the rightful heir, and the transition of power began immediately. Benji stood beside her as the court swore their loyalty to her rule. He watched as the woman who had once been cast away like a mistake was now being hailed as the savior of her people. She turned to him, something deep and unspoken in her gaze. You stayed, she whispered. Benji smiled. You made it easy. Mira reached out, her fingers curling around his. She had been banished, she had been unwanted, but now she was home, and she would never run again.